we'll see how much better my voice is. You can kind of measure the disease progress, I guess, by how strong or not strong my voice is. In addition to whatever other signs and symbols you might have, like resculpted hair or weight, but that's all part of the package, and it does in fact help shape everything. It helps shape the thinking. It helps shape the dreaming. It helps shape remembering the dream. And the dream seems to get remembered every time I go through it. But it always starts the same. It always starts, as it did last week, V'zot HaTorah. And the inky Torah of the hand that changes week by week, sometimes day by day, and reflects, I think, the joining of Torah with Torah. The written Torah only held up by virtue of the hands that are feeble and increasingly enfeebled. And one generation after the next shares its Torah and expands its Torah and fills and fulfills its Torah in the Torah that is the written one, crowding, well, I shouldn't say crowded, moving into the infinite space between the letters. There's this holy rabbinic fantasy of there always being room in the temple, that people would crowd in and be stuffed shoulder to shoulder. And yet when it was time to prostrate themselves, there was place for everybody to lay out. I think I said time before, but joining time and space is not such a bad mistake. There was space for everybody to lie out. Omdim revachim, standing up, crowded together. Mishtachavim revachim, lying down, plenty of space for everybody. This is the ongoing fantasy of the temple. It's the ongoing challenge to people who want to visualize what a temple would look like these days. Is there, in fact, no end of the room in the temple? Is there no end of the room in the dream? I wander into yours and you wander into mine. And like the poet said, everyone who wakes in the morning is alone and is Abraham. Everyone is brought to the Akedah and is Isaac. We're all Abraham. Can we also all be Isaac? I think so. I think it's possible for all of us to be Abraham and for all of us to be Isaac. And certainly for all of us to be bound. To be bound like the Akedah. We're bound to a vision. We're bound to expectations. Not only that, we bind ourselves to visions and also to expectations. It's right here at this point that Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon continues his vision, his thoughts about aging. With Abraham, you'll remember, Abraham insisted of God, there must be signs of aging. Otherwise, who are we going to know to whom to pay deference? If everybody looks alike until the very end of his or her life, what does another generation have to look forward to? What are the signs of nurturance? What are the signs of hopefulness? What are those creases and crevices that mark our change, that enliven and strengthen our children and even our grandchildren? Just a little line here and a little line there, and poof, all of a sudden I look like my mother. It's an extraordinary thing. It's a wondrous thing. Some people might think it's a terrible thing, but I believe that in an age where people are more and more frightened about such things, that we ought to try really hard to see, like Yehuda Bar Simon, and to understand the beauty and the Torah that exists behind and with all of these changes. So Abraham begins to look strangely like his grandfather, let's say. Or like his father. And Isaac looks to him and expects him to look like that and draws strength from him looking like that. Certain amount of joy and exhilaration by looking like a twin when you're 30 years older, like that hand cream or dishwashing to dawn, I think it was, years ago. That was pretty neat, but it wasn't realistic, and it's not the kind of commercial that's going to be made today. Today, we want to be the people that we are, and aging is certainly possible. There's an interesting thing about living in a Torah world that is a very, very small world. It has a very small capacity, has a very limited vocabulary, and a very limited number of images, especially in the early chapters. And when a new grand word like aging is introduced, we want to know why. We want to know why it wasn't introduced before, when certainly people were getting older and living extraordinarily long lives. And Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon takes that desire and teases it into an important teaching that stands up straight and tall in the white spaces between the letters. Wait a minute, V'Avraham Zakein ba bayamim. Abraham got old getting along in days. Why not just getting along in days? That's what everybody else did. They got along in days until they didn't get along with their days or in their days anymore. But for Abraham is Zakein. And here is Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon in some way becoming Abraham and grabbing God by the lapels and saying, wait a minute, this isn't right. There is something strangely wrong about generations that don't contribute, that don't wrinkle, that don't show their vulnerable and venerable sides, who don't look like as well as act like models of behavior. There's something less than rich under those circumstances. And God says, you're right, to Abraham, and it will start with you. And so Abraham and Zakein come together. And before Abraham, in this limited story with its limited vocabulary, there is no Zakein. Abraham is the first. And the story is that Abraham's hair changes color and becomes white, and that he exhibits other signs of change. As I said, quoting my poet friend Rivka Miriam, she says proudly, I have merited every wrinkle and every crevice that I have. There's nothing that is there that I did not merit having. And I like to think that we could all say that. So there in sum is the story of a confrontation between Abraham and God. The insistence, Abraham's insistence, that this must enter the world on human terms, and God simply had not thought about it. The extraordinary eternality of God. Put this below the horizon, let's say. And God just hadn't thought about it. Well, his censors, that is to say, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon's censors, continue. And they continue with Isaac. Now, with Isaac, as you would imagine from the balance of a good midrashic painter, good midrashic master, there's something different. And Isaac was old, and his eyes failed. Isaac was old, and his eyes failed. And that sets the stage for the story that we know of Jacob and Esau, and of the gamesmanship and the furtive nature of stealing the blessing, stealing a bracha, being fooled by clothing and smells, or perhaps fooled by clothing and smells, touches, tastes. The only story really in the whole Tanakh that uses all of our senses, that appeals to all of our senses. And in this chapter of the story, Isaac is the one. Isaac says to God, you know, it would be really good for us if we lived with some infirmities. If we lived with some infirmities, the bowstring of the attribute of justice would not be pulled so taut against us. And God says, you know, you're right. I never thought about it, but it'll start with you. And so it says of Isaac that his eyesight fails him. And this is the first infirmity that's mentioned in the Torah. With Abraham, it's age and characteristics of aging. And with Isaac, it's infirmity and constraints on the body. Are they constraints on the spirit? Well, perhaps so. Perhaps it's worth unpacking a little bit what it means by the bowstring of justice is drawn taut against someone who lives without infirmity. One who lives without infirmity understands his or her health, let's say, to be a God-given right. And if it's assailed or assaulted, that's a terrible thing, and is deserving of fist shaking, white-knuckled fist shaking, and clenching of teeth and anger, and I am not getting my due. This is not just. This is not justice. The rabbis scratched their heads over this as well. And what they thought was that living with infirmities paid off some of the debt and also the interest on what was due in the world to come. Who knew in this zero-sum game what you had done or what you had not done that was accounted against you in heaven above? But if you suffered a little bit, if you had some kind of infirmity, maybe not a little bit, maybe a lot, you would be paying off both the debt and the principal. Does that make sense? That was their theology. It is not ours. But Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon won't let us get tripped up over what is our philosophy or theology that we own. He has something else bigger and broader that he wants to tell us. And I can begin by giving you an example of a time that I remember when I was tripped up. I was about 45 years old, maybe a little bit older. And I found that I had to wear glasses for the first time. And it really troubled me. It really troubled me. I shouldn't have to wear glasses. My right is my good vision. And it's my right for a combination of genetic factors and also magical, alchemical factors. My father was an optician. I could get them wholesale. Wouldn't even cost a lot of money. But I didn't need them. I worked for my father for a couple of summers, and I enjoyed putting on frames and posing like Joseph in the Midrash in front of mirrors and seeing which ones looked studious and which ones looked sexy and which ones looked compelling and which ones looked like they belonged on my face. And so, but at the end of the hour, I always got to take them off, clean them, fold them, and put them back on the rack. But not this time. This time I had to take them and get them made into a real pair of glasses that would help my vision. Now, I'm sure it's just a coincidence that my father's name is Yitzchak, and that my infirmity was my eyes, at least at that point, it was my eyes. We'll just let that go for the moment. But the glasses were made in rather short order. They were simple glasses after all, and could be made in a day if you had the lab and all the materials to work with. And I took them to the synagogue that afternoon and sat down with a bat mitzvah student. And I sheepishly pulled them from my pocket so that I could look over her shoulder and see her haftarah clearly, and tried not to make much noise. But she looked around and she saw that I was wearing glasses. And she said to me, "I didn't know you wore glasses." And I told her a bit of the story, kind of mournfully, made her my rabbi for a minute or two. And her response to me was, "Oh, I've been wearing glasses since I was 4. And then she went back to her haftarah. And I realized that while for me, the bowstring of the attribute of justice might be drawn very tight, and I might feel the tremor, I might feel the arrow piercing me, that for her, the bowstring of justice was loose. There was no bowstring pulled against her at all. She had lived and grown and laughed and flourished and learned and shared and loved and played with this, what I would call infirmity. And she would call this natural state. This was her life we were talking about. So when Isaac says to God, if we had some infirmities with which to live, we would be in some ways better off, because the bowstring of the attribute of justice would not be pulled so tight against us all the time. It's not that we would take it so seriously all the time, that everything is a punishment. It might be a consequence, but certainly it was not a punishment for anything that we had done, that I had done, that you had done. And so we move away from the theology of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon, but I, in my dream, would refuse to move away from his basic point, which is that infirmity is its own sentence, or living with infirmity in a particular way is its own sentence, and it doesn't have to be. Can you move around in your infirmity in some way? whatever it is? Can you move around inside it? Can you find a life with it in its presence, in that infirmity? And Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon says, yes, you can, and you should. Relax the attribute of justice. Relax it. It's still there, but relax it. And God says, by heavens, you're right. And I never thought about it. The second time in 2 generations that God had just not thought about something because the power of eternity is so great and so exalted and so high that it overlooks certain things. Can't think about everything. You can tell the truth and nothing but the truth, but not the whole truth. There's something that you can't quite tell. It takes human beings to be partners with the divine in order for that to happen. So Yehuda Bar Simon rescues us for ourselves, rescues me for myself for the second time. V'zot HaTorah, and this also is the Torah. V'zot HaTorah asher sam Moshe. And people in my dream are looking around and they're seeing me, and they're seeing the Torah, and they're seeing Abraham, and they're seeing Isaac, and they're seeing it all in themselves. Really? Can you see yourself as Isaac in 2 different generations? I play with that thought. I think about it. I found out, or I was reminded a couple of weeks ago, that my best friend Eddie had a grandfather whose name was Michal, Yitzchak ben Michal. Yitzchak ben Michal, and his father was Yitzchak ben Michal. Yitzchak ben Michal ben Yitzchak ben Michal, telling a story of a man who never knew his son, and a child who never knew his father. One named after the other, one following the other, but their deeds very much mimicking one another. Part of the same story they were, part of the same sacred story. Yitzchak ben Michal ben Yitzchak ben Michal. This one looking into the back of that one looking into the back of that one. V'zot HaTorah, v'zot HaTorah. And this is the Torah, and this is the Torah. And it excites me to get the gifts of such stories. And I think about how to share them, and I think about how to tell them, and how to remember them without recasting them all the time. And I realize stories are meant to be recast and reshaped, because it needs to be your story, Judith, and your story, Richard, and your story, Elliot, and your story, Shella. It needs to be everybody's story. And gender notwithstanding, these are the experiences. You know, as children, as parents, we are bound. We are ni'akad. We are bound to an altar. There is something of expectation. There's something, what is it that makes a parent say to a child, you know what, I really want you to do this for me. I really want you, in Esau's case, I really want you to take the time to go out to the field, to hunt the game, to find the deer, to properly kill it, to skin it, to age the meat, to make the fire, to cook the meal, to make the sauces, to keep the flies away, to bring it to me, because I don't know. It's not even like I feel like I'm dying. The Bible text speaks in extremes. Isaac feels like he's dying. But what has that to do necessarily with wanting to give to a child, to give to someone, a blessing that is almost too deep for words, that rises only on the first and the last words that would come from you? There is something of mortality and richness there, but not anxiety and not fear. And what does it mean from the beginning of a story that really just speaks in extremes to say, he was old and his eyes left him, his eyesight failed? Does it mean all at once that he went blind? Was he thrown into a cave like his grandson Joseph would be? Did he immediately, quickly lose his eyes for the sake of the story that would unfold? Not the way I look at it, not the way I am looking at it, as somebody who's aging into that, but rather, I don't know, Jane, it looked like you had something to say about it, but you're on mute. No? Okay. Just break in. Rather the soft dulling at the edges of the eye, maybe the change in color and shadow, maybe the changing reflection of your own eyelashes, even the growth of cataracts. I remember the first time that I had my eyes photographed to look at the cataracts. Robert Rosenstein, Oliver Sholem, showed me these pictures, and they were beautiful. They were little interior universes. How angry could you be at some little interior universe? The eyes get shadowed, the eyes get shaded, the vision changes, it morphs. Finally, it gets to a point where it becomes a partner in dexterity, in the loss of dexterity or sure-footedness. And at a certain point along the way, when a certain stage of ripeness is achieved, and who knows how to really name that ripeness, you say to a child or you say to somebody who is a confidant, I need to be assured in this particular way. I'm going to keep you bound to the promise of staying with me. And I want you to do these things. And I know it's going to take you a long time. And I know it's not easy. But rising out of that moment is going to be the deepest bracha that I can find. What's it going to be? I'm not sure that I exactly know. Let's wait and find that out. So these dreams continue to wash over me and through me, and I'd love to put them on the computer, and I will, but my hands are not as dexterous as they used to be. These neuropathies are damaging my fingers in some way. So I take a notebook and I and I write. Don't know whether you can see it. Purple ink, turquoise ink. Those are the dream colors. Those are the dream ink colors. And ultimately, I will put these things on the computer with some difficulty, but probably not with as much difficulty as it actually takes me to fill a fountain pen and to do the writing, which I do lovingly and I do carefully, and I try to do consistently, because it's the only way to capture the interim stages of a dream. Capturing it with my, I don't know, with a butter knife, with a butterfly net fashioned from my eyelashes. And so I have it. It doesn't mean that he went blind all at once. That's what I wrote in turquoise. It doesn't mean that he was plunged into the darkness of the pit. Perhaps he had learned how to keep the bowstring loosened, observing, attending the drama and the trauma of the Akedah. Perhaps not. Perhaps not, but perhaps. And as he felt bound, the other Isaac in front of him felt bound, the Zot HaTorah, Yitzchak, who is the father of the Yitzchak who follows. Both of them bound to some vision. And how is it that we fulfill our obligation to the way in which we were bound? In what way were we bound? Are we bound? In what ways do we bind? Certainly the way we act, the way we live, the way we proceed, the way we govern, the values that we hold. And not only that, really, but by the way we bury. Who has ultimate authority in the way that we bury? It's the one who's already buried. It's the generation that has gone before. We do it this way because it was done this way. And there might be variations on a theme, but that's how we proceed in general. Being tied to the earth in that extremely potent, powerful, and beautiful way. And we keep searching for the words that we would look for in order to speak of these things and to tell our own dreams into the larger story. But largely we don't find them, or we can't find them, or if the muscle of the search fails us, then we rely on the dream itself, because everybody is a Torah contained within a Torah, following a Torah, preceding a Torah, raising the Torah on increasingly feebly arms and proclaiming V'zot HaTorah. This is the Torah. Every so often, a poet will break through Let me read you one by a poet named Elchanan Nir, a poet whom you don't know. Neither the inner rooms of argument and soul, that don't reveal themselves except to those that search on summer nights. Neither the inner rooms or souls that don't reveal themselves except to those that search on summer nights, that suddenly allow fingers to grasp the words, that cries, "This body is the beginning of all discovery. This body fell for you from the world of the void. That is the mountain of burning fire upon which the ancient Torah is given just now." Search, 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 search. Look for the words, maybe on a hot, sticky summer evening after you have gotten in bed and gone to sleep, you'll actually find the words and they'll remind you. They're sulfurous and also appealing smell. Remind you that there is that there was a moment where you fell from the void. Do you hear any discrepancy there with the stories that you know? A moment that you fell from the void. Are you ignoring me because I'm so compelling? Okay, fair enough. We don't usually see that. In fact, I have never seen that before. Fell from the void. The void is something that's supposed to be below, right? And yet he raises it up above and it comes down through the void and becomes the Torah that was given from the burning mountain and given anew, given right now so that I can hear it and that I can understand it. I love this overturning of the world of which he is capable and brave enough to propound. Falling from the void. Yes, Debbie.
Is it the creation story?
It is the creation story, and it's the creation story upended in a very powerful way. Yeah, Jane.
But I thought that there wasn't a void, that it's not a Jewish thing for there to be a void, because if there was, it was before God, and God, so God inhabited the void. It makes me think of Icarus, which is pagan, falling from the sky. But the other, it just doesn't seem Jewish.
Falling from the sky to his death, not falling from the sky to his life. Yeah. Well, we have to remember that these sages, my heroes, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon included, lived in Hellenistic world. And the images and the stories and the iconography and the sculpture, it was all in their heads, the legends, the songs, the language, everything. They breathed it in all the time. The question is always, how do you transpose this into the key of Jewish life? And for us, it remains exactly the same question. How do you do that? And what gets transposed? What gets transported? What gets done? How much of a transparency is his life that he can see this? I admire him so greatly. How much of a transparency can I make my life so that y'all can see it? or you for somebody else. It happens that my position has always been one of a certain kind of leadership, better and more eloquently, I think, demonstrated than spoken about. And I'm just sharing with you what's going on, what's on my mind, what's in my heart, and using as a traveling companion Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon, who now twice has told us, here's something essential for human beings, and God never thought about it. What do you mean? What are you telling me about omniscience? What are you telling me about omnipotence if God never thought about it? If this is the idea of a person to whom God says, God damn, you're right. I never thought about that. Let's try it out. Let's start it. And it's going to start with you. Is that a good thing? Is that a blessing? I would say it's a victory for humankind. There was another hand flickering out there. I thought, yeah, Judith.
It puts me in mind of some discussions I remember about higher and deeper being reciprocals of the same process, so that divinity and depth within the human being are linked and are the same. I feel like I remember a discussion about that.
I think you do. Probably more than 10 as the years have progressed. When Amichai says there is one and only one door through which we leave and through which we enter. And once you leave through that door, your family name becomes the same as everybody else's family name. May her memory be a blessing. My mother's name from now until the resurrection of the dead is Frida. May her memory be a blessing. Oh, we're all related. Mazel tov. Everybody's got the same last name. All now linked and part of the same family. Another?
I was going to say,
Please, Abby.
Judith, what you said put me in mind of a question I had. How can we fall from the void fully formed, fall from above, and also be of dust and of earth and come from below? How can both of these things be true? And I don't know the answer, but I liked what you said about coming from the depths and the heights.
I'm glad you don't have an answer. It's better to have a question. I must say, it's the questions that keep me going, questions that keep me interested. If you want to say it's questions that keep me alive, it's certainly the questions that keep a big part of me alive. Not to mention your lovely letters, Abby, to which I have not responded. But I hope to. So here I am finding myself in the vision, in the artwork. Remember, I told you that I feel like I'm speaking with a different sense of authority now. I'm not trying to be a midrash scholar. I'm not trying to say precisely and cautiously only what can be said. I'm going out of my way to say what can't be said. There's not even absolute uniformity, as I told you last time, that Yehuda is the first name of this Rav. Never mind how it might be spelled, or even his provenance, but I don't care. I just don't care. This is my hero, or one of my heroes. Yeah.
So falling from the void makes me think of the concept of if you're not attached to anything and you're not stuck on earth and there's no gravity and you're floating out in space in the void alone. And it's sort of the mass of other things in earth that keeps us together, gravity, and pulls us to a place of community. That a void is being alone, floating in space.
Yes. And we have this as individuals and as community, this horror vacui, this fear of the void. We can't live in the presence of a void. We can't live within a void. So we wrap ourselves in our sacred stories, and we become and live and enliven our own Torahs, and we point to the Torah that gets lifted, and it gets lifted regularly and put before us, and we get to peer into it and look at the letters and observe not only the letters, but also their separation, that which makes them unique and standalone, and try to imagine what it would be to read our story in between those letters. Thank you. Harold or Susan.
Yeah, I was thinking this is an interesting void if Mount Sinai can fall from it. And, there's the moment of the giving of the Torah. This is not, a void's supposed to be empty, but it isn't empty. So it makes me wonder if this void is the void of what we're aware of, the void of what we normally can perceive, and that we can only perceive it after a lot of trial. And it's not a void at all. It's a whole domain that's always existed and exists right now.
Lovely. It's a domain of a particular kind in a particular world. And we are in it, and it is in us, and the thoughts of it are in us. There are people who have written beautifully about life in another world, on the other side of the door, and cast it as a way of speaking not only of what can be known, but of what can't be known. Yeah, Mindy.
When my father died, I wanted to say Kaddish, but I needed to not have God in the translation that I read, because my father would have not liked that. So I found a translation that Rabbi Zalman Schachter wrote and changed a little bit. And what it ended up was, I imagine and hope that the power residing in the life forces of the universe be increased and made sacred in this world, created from the dust of stars and mystery. And I think the void is that dust of stars and mystery that we really don't know and can't name, where what's on the other side of those doors is not for us to know. In some ways we can guess and we can imagine and we can read between the lines, between the spaces, but it seems as though that's in some ways what you're talking about.
I think it is. And that poem by Elchanan Nir, staying up late on summer nights and reaching, grasping for letters, for words, and then all of a sudden finding one or two that will help is extraordinary. This is a little meteor me falling from the sky, getting dense and cooler in the atmosphere where it can be beheld, held and beheld, and contributes to my sense of self-understanding. Torah that was given once and never and always. Janet.
Hi. When you were talking about the void just now, I very much thought of that image of the upper and lower waters and of those being connected to the unity of all things and the emptiness of all things. And I temporarily went blind about 20 years ago for a few days, and it was like being thrust into the void. It was an extraordinary experience in which that experience of the void was just manifest. I mean, it was like this unbelievably effusive place where creation was manifesting from. So to me, like what you were talking about, it makes sense that Isaac would be connected to that place of connecting to the void and this extraordinarily fertile void from which things are born from.
Thank you. And thank you for the experience, for sharing the experience, which certainly gives you a high claim for entering into the circle of imagination.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, it does.
Harlan.
And recently I was interested in what happens to stars. And when stars explode and they sprinkle, whether it's dust-like or whatever, onto a void, which may be the earth, that's what gives us oxygen and carbon and all the elements that are necessary to sustain life. And maybe it also goes into the void that Aviva Zornberg talks about when she tries to reckon with what tohu vavohu means, as the murmuring of the deep murmuring from the cries from which the rest of life emerges.
Including words. Yeah, including language. Thank you. Elliot.
Yes, when you say falling from the void, I have a vision more of falling through the void. Who are we when we come to the other side of it? You know, because sometimes we are forced into the void and then through the void. You know, example of today's, COVID. Today we're forced into seclusion to look at ourselves. We come through it. Who are we? Are we better for it? Are we worse for it? Are we more reflective of sensitive to people around us? Who are we?
Right. It fosters those kinds of questions. And so I wonder whether Isaac is essentially right by saying, some infirmity would do us well, would do us fine. We learn how to live inside it. We learn how to be flexible with it. We learn how to be creative in its presence. We learn how to use its energies in the way they tap our emotions and our souls differently than we would under other circumstances. And our health is not a right. It is not a matter of the midat hadin. It's not strict justice. That's different, drawing down the bow and making things tighter and tighter. That's not what we're talking about, God. And if it's what the Torah thinks we're talking about, then the Torah needs to be changed, or the Torah needs to be expanded. The Torah needs to be something that can be used and interpreted, elevated and enriched by real living people with feeble arms who raise the Torah above themselves. And at the same time that they raise it above themselves, they're ready to and committed to changing it. To understand that our stories come from that Torah and go to that Torah and are contained within that Torah, and that we are that Torah, made from clay, made from humus, the human made from the humus. And we can be disassembled into those states. I want to tell you that that's how I felt when I walked a week or so ago to my mother's grave, which was very difficult for me. It was up a little bit of a hill that in another lifetime would have given me no problem at all. But it was up a little bit of a hill, and I was using a walker that was not meant for, or maybe it was meant precisely for such terrain, but it was certainly an obstacle to my walking. And I made my way up the hill slowly, following the casket. And by the time I got there, I felt completely undone. You know, I'm going to take a 1 minute bio break and let y'all talk amongst yourselves, okay? I'm back. I'm back. So here I was walking up the hill and thinking about that Greek myth whose characters have been bleached from my mind except for Hercules. But he's fighting a son of the earth goddess. And as long as this fellow's feet touch the ground, his power is increased. And if Hercules picks him up and throws him, dashes him to the ground, his power is increased more. And finally, Hercules gets it and picks him up and breaks his contact with the ground until he weakens. And then he dispatches him. So that's the myth. But it's not what I experienced going up the hill. What I experienced was a first gradual and then more profound dissolution of my strength. It was hard to control the wheels of the walker. It was hard to follow the casket. It was hard to be walking behind or with these folks, friends of mine and cousins and relatives and friends of my mother and my brothers, whose infirmities are not manifest in this way. And to become so human as to almost be indistinguishable from the humus, from the soil. And to realize that the legend was making the legend. The sacred story was making its claim on me. Why was I climbing this hill? Because my mother demanded it. You know, and I don't say that in a bad way. Because tradition demanded it. Because this is the way that we conduct ourselves. And it all starts with the death. It all starts with the story, with the sacred story. And we're born into it. And teachers like Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon work very hard to allow us to see our stories, to add our stories to that story. But whether we're successful in doing that or not is a different issue. The story is there. Sometimes we can rely on the story of the Yitzchak who was right in front of us, maybe our great-grandfather, maybe our father whose name happens to be Yitzchak, maybe somebody else. But to make a claim or to be claimed by that name is to join the story. And ultimately, you might have to use this, you might use the story in order to make sense. A hand, did I see a hand? I thought I did. I wonder whether Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon, just to sum it up, I wonder whether Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon understood that the Bible speaks in extremes, that the Torah speaks in extremes. I shouldn't say that. Of course he did. Infirmity, blindness. Blindness, setting the stage for the story that had to happen next. The gamesmanship, the hunt between smell and taste and touch and feel and sound, waged by or engaged in by his two sons. Was the blindness the necessary prerequisite? Was it blindness? Perhaps he had cataracts. Perhaps his vision faded, in which case he might have, with our technology, been able to retrieve it, as I was several weeks ago, still with this story in mind. But add technology to our living experience and to our understanding of things. But I wonder whether for Isaac, whether it had to be blindness. Maybe it was something, as I said earlier, that was a little bit more graceful, a little bit more magical, a little bit more beautiful, a little bit more subtle, a little bit less frightening, something into which he could grow, something behind which he could hide, frankly, if he wanted to. He wasn't obliged now to see everything or respond to everything. Did he make room for the inner blessing to start to rise within him, not being on the far edge of his life, but being far enough along with enough signposts to say, I really should be thinking about this. And in thinking about this, hearing Esau differently. Taking Esau or being taken by Esau to an Akedah, never imagined. Esau taking Isaac to the Akedah, there's a story that we've not told. But it's a story that needs to be told. What are the parents' expectations of their children? I learn and relearn it every day with my 3 kids, every day now. What are the children's expectations of their parents? What do I think they expect? What do I learn about what they really expect? All of this is to be ne'ekad. All of this is to be bound to a story, and to be free to break the bonds of the story, to expand it, which is what our Torah needs to do. Our unique Torah needs to figure out how to both protect the bounds of the story and also how to break the bonds of the story. And that's what comes up in the Seder as well. We'll be having this conversation before too long. And why not bring in the perspective of the one with infirmity? The Torah doesn't speak about 4 children. The Torah speaks about 4 persons and ought to be speaking about more. And Amichai says, what about the person who's loyal? And what about the person who's naive? And we might add, what about the person who's aging, or the person who lives with infirmities, or has first discovered this capacity or lack of capacity in herself or himself? Is the Torah talking about them too? And how do we unfold them? Never mind, maybe we don't actually have a Bible verse. The way the Haggadah is laid out, we have these Bible verses that are just right. But maybe we don't. Maybe we ought not. Maybe we ought to set aside the Bible verses and think in terms of the people and the characters themselves. Dibra Torah, Keneged Arba Banim Dibra Torah. The Torah speaks about 4. Zot HaTorah, V'zot HaTorah, V'zot HaTorah, V'zot HaTorah. And each one of them is speaking to the other, and reflexively and reflectively, each one is inside the other. We are all of them. And I think that the next time we meet, we'll turn ourselves away from this. And we will remember that Isaac said to God, wait a minute, not so fast. You're getting past this I thing really quickly. And it's representative of something bigger, which sculpts us as people, as individuals, as humans, as writers of our own Torah, as participants in the Torah of others. We'll move past him and move to Jacob. And I will tell you in advance that Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon, our sentry with each of these patriarchs, is going to say, you know, it would be a good idea if we had a final illness, if we had something that had a trajectory towards an end. That would allow us to settle up. That would allow us a claim on our story, the telling of our story and the hearing of our story in a very different way. And God said, by God, you're right. By me, you're right. And it will start with you. And Jacob is the first one in the Torah to be called Choleh. The verses expand, the chapters expand, the vocabulary expands. Choleh, sick. Well, people perhaps have been sick before, but the word had never been used. And it is that on which Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon builds the 3rd piece of his foundation. So we will call it a night. I hope that your Torah is a sweet one for Pesach, and that your Pesach is a sweet one that matches the Torah that you need to and want to tell. And I hope in some ways this contributes to it. And in some ways it contributes to what I really deeply hope is an understanding of how it is that somebody hears these teachings and claims his heroes. So until next time, Aziz and Pesach, Chag Sameach, and we will do it again. Good night.
Chag Sameach.
Night.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Chag
Rabbi.
Sameach.
Night.